As a pillar of economic development, gold has seen wars fought over it, and it has been at the epicenter of one of the most serious diplomatic conflicts between Germany and the US after Berlin failed to repatriate or at least audit its precious metal reserve stored in New York. RT's Peter Oliver has the story.
There was a time when taking gold out of the US Federal Reserve was only for Hollywood to suggest.
Fort Knox! Ha! It's for tourists!
And Bruce Willis to stop.
Yippee-ki-yay,
But the financial crisis in Europe saw Germany decide it wanted to bring home a significant chunk of the precious metal from the United States. Despite the aim to ship 300 tons to Frankfurt by 2020, so far they've only managed to bring back just over 10% of that.
The Americans are taking good care of our gold. We have no reasons for mistrust.
Not so, say critics of the slow progress. The $635 billion of gold in US vaults has never been fully inspected by Germany.
Why we haven't been allowed to inspect this escapes me. I'm no conspiracy theories, but the Bundesbank should be able to audit the gold once a year like it does with the reserves in Frankfurt.
The lack of inspection has led some to question if it's still there.
Even after at least one decade of asking Bundesbank and the Fed, there is still no shred of evidence that the German gold is untouched in the New York Fed's vaults. We are still missing, for example, published bar number lists, even though the US, the Federal Reserve, does publish these lists for their own gold.
Germany has the world's second largest gold reserves, worth $141 billion. Currently, 45% of that is stored in New York, 13% in London, 11% in Paris, although the 374 tons in France is set to be all returned to Germany. The rest is in the Bundesbank vaults in Frankfurt. Anyone questioning the safety of the gold reserves have been laughed off as conspiracy theorists by those in charge. They say it's solid financial management. The Bundesbank maintain that their plan is on track. However, they do face a potential logistical headache as they try and return almost 700 tons of gold from New York and Paris back here to Germany safe and sound by the 2020 deadline. Peter Oliver, RT, Berlin.
I'm Judge Andrew Napolitano, and this is Freedom Watch. Is there any gold in Fort Knox? Now, the question sounds like a joke, sort of like the one about who's buried in Grant's tomb. But suddenly, it's a very serious question that's become a part of the major national financial reform debate. After the financial turmoil of the past 2 years and the related decline in the value of the dollar, gold has become an even hotter commodity than usual. That's a reminder to hardcore free market advocates that a gold standard once was used to back our currency, making it harder for the government simply to print more money willy-nilly to cover its bills. Not surprisingly, the Federal Reserve has been resistant to an audit of its money printing and money lending activities, even as the idea of an audit has become more popular on both sides of the aisle and in both houses of Congress. More surprisingly, though, they've also been resistant to a simple audit of their gold supplies at Fort Knox and in the New York Fed's vaults. Why? Is there less gold there than there is supposed to be? Has the United States government sold off more of its gold since going off the gold standard than we were led to believe? Joining me now to talk about all of this is the chair of the Mises Institute and a champion of free markets and sound money, Lew Rockwell. Lew, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Judge, great to be with you.
Is there any gold left in Fort Knox?
Well, I think we'd like to find out. Ron Paul talks about this, why there ought to be an audit. There has not been an audit since the 1950s. And we know that a vast amount of gold flowed out of the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s under LBJ and Nixon because of all the inflation right at the end of the Bretton Woods system. So how much gold is there? We don't know. So Ron Paul says, how about an audit of the Fed, of the gold stock? What do they got? But they resist. Why do they resist? As you said, is the question.
Right. Well, one could only speculate as to why they resist. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but Congressman Paul's original piece of legislation, which we all know by its nomenclature, H.R. 1207, which was passed by the House of Representatives, would have provided for such an audit. But once it got watered down in the Senate, and the watered down version is now on its way back to the House, it doesn't include that audit at all. It's basically reduced to just an audit of the banks that the Fed bailed out, not under TARP, but under the stimulus programs that preceded and succeeded TARP. So without some new legislation, we won't know if there's any gold left in Fort Knox, or if there is, who owns it.
Well, and these are important issues, and I must say I tend to be a skeptic when it comes to the government in every sense. I tend to assume that everything they say is a lie. Now, everything they say is not a lie, but most of what they say is a lie. So seems to me they need to prove to us, need to let an independent assayers go in there, count the gold, and test some of the bars to see, are they gold? Same with the vaults of the New York Fed. Who owns the gold in the vaults of the New York Fed? Is it foreign governments? Is it the IMF? Is it the U.S. government? Is it the Fed itself? They stonewall on this as well, and I think we have the right, as Ron Paul certainly does, to know what the heck is the real story.
In 1933, in an executive order, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on his own, made it illegal for private persons to own gold. About 2 weeks later, the Congress, kowtowing, enacted legislation that tracked the executive order and said, okay, the president's already done this. We will now make it really illegal for Americans to own gold. Eventually, that was changed. In 1973, President Nixon took us off the gold standard. Question. I want you to speculate, Lou. I want you to dream a little bit. What would life be like today had FDR and the Congress not made it illegal to own gold, and had President Nixon not taken us off the gold standard?
Well, Judge, if we were still on a gold standard, and this is going to sound a little bit like science fiction, but this was the case all throughout American history, and indeed all throughout the history of the world under a gold standard, your money, your savings becomes more valuable each year. Even if you don't get a raise, your paycheck buys more. The savings that a young person puts away in their 20s when they want to spend them in their 70s buy more. This is the way a free market society operates, because they're not expanding the money supply, but the goods and services are being expanded, so money becomes more valuable. This is the way it's supposed to be. It requires vast efforts by the government, by the Federal Reserve, to actually turn this around and make our money depreciate and make its value diminish and even disappear. And so also, by the way, we'd have far more freedom, because a gold standard strictly restricts the government's ability to do a lot of the crazy unconstitutional stuff they do today. So they can only do it when they can print up the money.
So a Democrat and a Democratic Congress, FDR and the Congress in 1933, and a Republican president on his own have succeeded in taking away freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and property for what? So that the government can print money to pay its bills.
And these, by the way, you know, as you pointed out, these are acts by these two presidents that are the acts of a dictator. These are not anything the founding fathers envisioned. The president being able to confiscate everybody's money or change the monetary system of the whole country just by signing a piece of paper and issuing it like he's Caesar Augustus.
Lou Rockwell, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge.
You can catch today's show on foxnews.com/freedomwatch and on Sirius 145, XM 168, or online at foxnewstalk.com at 6 p.m. Eastern on Saturdays. From New York, defending freedom. Until the next time, stay free, America.
Mr. Chairman, I tell you, knowing that you, for many years, had picked up more and more support for your bill, legislation to audit the Federal Reserve. I mean, I wish, truthfully, and it has nothing to do with you gentlemen here today, but I'm telling you that the distrust out here by the American people is as deep and severe as I've ever seen. And it does, not only Congress itself, not only the administration, but the Federal Reserve is just at this point at a very low ebb as it relates to trust. And I'm not talking about you personally. You're two men of high integrity, I know that. But right now, the Federal Reserve is not held in high esteem by many people in this country. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I have a few short questions, and then we'll finish up. The one thing is, on a follow-up on what Mr. Jones says, the confidence is very low. But when you speak of independence, and I understand your terms, and I disagree with the need for that, but I understand it. But what people hear when you say independence, they hear secrecy. You know, you're going to keep it from us. And like the point I made at the beginning, the SEC is to pressure companies to reveal information, where the Federal Reserve does the opposite. They want, no, we can't tell anything because it might disturb the markets. But I do have one question. During the crisis, or any time that you're aware of, has the Federal Reserve or Treasury participated in any gold swaps arrangements?
We don't, the Federal Reserve does not own any gold at all. We have not owned gold since 1934. So we have not engaged in any gold swaps.
But it appears on your balance sheet that you hold gold.
What appears on our balance sheet is gold certificates. When we turned before 1934, the Federal Reserve did own gold. We turned that over by law to the Treasury and received in return for that gold certificates.
If the Treasury entered into, because under the Exchange Stabilization Fund, I would assume they probably have the legal authority to do it, they wouldn't be able to do it then because you have the securities for essentially all the gold?
No, we have no interest in the gold that is owned by the Treasury. We have simply an accounting document that is called gold certificates that represents the value at a statutory rate
and still
that we gave to the Treasury in 1930.
And still measured at $42 an ounce, which makes no sense whatsoever. But you know, the conventional wisdom today says that gold is really not money. We don't want it to be money. I mean, if you're for the gold standard, there's something wrong with you. Yet we hold the gold. And, you know, there have been suggestions made, and I've sort of, encouraged the suggestion. You know, if gold is not money and it's an asset, and you don't even use it because it's on your balance sheets and you don't even use it at the real value, would you have a position on this? Why shouldn't the Treasury just sell the gold, give it back to the people? The people had it at one time. Let the people have it. Would you have any objection to that? Would you advise us and say, no, that's not good. We ought to hold the gold. Do you think holding the gold is a good idea or a bad idea?
So I have no position on that at all. That's clearly
no position.
Treasury. It's a matter for the Treasury. It's not within the purview of the Federal Reserve.
Mr. Baxter, would you have an opinion?
My opinion is I agree with Mr. Alvarez.
No position. Well, it's amazing because I've asked questions of the Federal Reserve, the members of the board for years, and whether it's been Mr. Greenspan, I can't recall exactly whether I've asked Mr. Bernanke, but it's always, well, no, we have to hold on to these assets. But if it's not money and we don't need it, we're not going on a gold standard, I mean, I would think that they shouldn't be holding it. The reason I ask that is the truth is gold is money, and people don't throw it away, and people do cling to it. But I would be really, there's a lot of people who suspect, because of this lack of transparency, that there's been a tremendous amount of gold swaps and loans made, and central banks sold a lot of gold after these the last 10 years. A lot of the gold has left the West and has gone to the East. And the central banks that now have positive trade balances, they buy up the gold. There has to be a message in there and a significance, even for those who don't want the restraints of gold. It has to be a message out there that we should look at, because we're in a financial mess. And it has to do with our monetary system, and it's being reflected today in rising prices and a weak economy. And just printing all this money isn't doing any good. All this stuff that's been done for 3 years, and you look at the economic statistics now, they're horrible. And these people who lost their jobs, they're still unemployed. The people who bought stocks in the year 2000, if they held on, they probably haven't even broken even. They probably lost purchasing power. So eventually, I know this is off the subject a little bit, but it is reflected only in that we don't know exactly what goes on. And people, when they don't know, then they get suspicious and they say, well, it's kept secret from us. Why aren't we allowed to know? And we just march on. And the type of dollars we're talking about. And when we hear about this money going to central banks and banks that Gaddafi was a part owner in, I mean, this stuff is, this really stirs up the emotions of a lot of people. But I do appreciate you being here, and I know that there'll be a lot of questions. There will be written questions submitted, and we'd appreciate your cooperation and send us our answers back. And I thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.
This hearing is adjourned.